The morning my brother called frantically asking for my signature on the sale papers was the same morning the keys to my fifth restaurant location were placed in my hands. 7 years earlier, he had stood in our family's kitchen and told me I was too naive to understand real business, that my ideas would destroy everything our grandfather had built. He threw me out of Thompson's family diner with nothing but harsh words and the certainty that I'd come crawling back within months. Now, with his business failing and creditors closing in, he needed the signature of the sister he claimed would never amount to anything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Lisa Marie Thompson, and I grew up believing that the smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee grounds was what home was supposed to smell like. In Millfield, Ohio, our family diner wasn't just a business, it was a legacy, a cornerstone of the community, and the beating heart of everything I thought I wanted to become. Thompson's family diner sat on the corner of Main Street and Elm Avenue, a brick building with large windows that caught the morning sun and cast warm light across red vinyl booths that had witnessed 3 generations of local families sharing meals, celebrations, and everyday conversations. My grandfather, Thomas Thompson, had opened the doors in 1962 with a simple philosophy: serve good food, treat people right, and work harder than anyone expects. The black and white photographs hanging on the walls told the story of those early days. Grandpa in his white apron, standing proudly behind the counter. My grandmother Helen managing the register with her signature warm smile. By the time I was old enough to see over the counter, the diner had become an institution. Local farmers started their days with coffee and eggs before heading to the fields. Business owners held informal meetings over lunch. High school students gathered, after football games, cramming into booths and ordering plates of fries with enough ketchup to scandalize any health inspector. The regulars had their own unspoken reserved seats, their usual orders memorized by staff who had been serving them for decades. I was 8 years old when I first convinced Dad to let me help during the Saturday morning rush. Standing on a wooden crate behind the register, carefully counting change and learning to read the handwritten tickets that our cooks used to track orders, I felt like I was participating in something important. The controlled chaos of a busy restaurant kitchen fascinated me. The precise timing required to get eggs, bacon, and hash browns to the table while everything was still hot. The way experienced servers could balance multiple plates while navigating around chairs and chattering customers. The satisfaction of seeing families enjoy meals that we had prepared with care. Dad, Robert Thompson, had taken over from Grandpa in 1985, maintaining the same commitment to quality and community connection while gradually modernizing operations. He upgraded the equipment, expanded the menu to include dinner options, and added a small catering service for local events. Under his management, Thompson's remained profitable and respected, a reliable fixture in a town where many businesses struggled to survive economic changes that favored chain stores and corporate franchises. My older brother David had always been Dad's natural successor, or so everyone assumed. 3 years older than me, he'd started working at the diner as soon as child labor laws permitted, learning every aspect of food preparation and customer service through hands-on experience. While I was still in elementary school, David was already managing opening procedures, training new employees, and handling the weekend rush with the confidence of someone who'd grown up understanding that this business would eventually be his responsibility. But even as a child, I noticed things that others seemed to overlook. The way certain processes could be streamlined to reduce wait times. How our seating arrangement created bottlenecks during busy periods. Why some menu items consistently generated waste while others sold out too quickly. I would sketch floor plan improvements on napkins, time different preparation methods during slow periods, and ask questions about inventory management that made Dad chuckle and David roll his eyes. My fascination with the business side of restaurant operations intensified throughout high school. While my classmates worked part-time jobs to earn spending money, I treated my shifts at Thompson's as an apprenticeship in entrepreneurship. I learned to read profit and loss statements, understand food cost percentages, and analyze sales patterns to predict busy periods. When we hired new employees, I watched how different training approaches affected their performance and retention rates. During slow afternoons, I would reorganize storage areas for better efficiency or experiment with menu presentation to increase customer satisfaction. David's approach was fundamentally different. He mastered the technical aspects of food service. With impressive skill, he could manage multiple orders simultaneously, handle difficult customers with practiced diplomacy, and maintain consistency in food quality even during the most hectic rushes. But his interest remained focused on execution. Rather than innovation, he preferred proven methods over experimental improvements, valued tradition over adaptation, and viewed change as an unnecessary risk to establish success. Our different perspectives didn't create serious conflict during high school because our roles were clearly defined. David handled operational management while I contributed through detailed task completion and analytical observation. Dad appreciated both approaches, praising David's reliability and my curiosity with equal enthusiasm. The family dynamic felt balanced, with each of us contributing unique strengths toward a shared enterprise. College changed everything. While David continued working full-time at the diner after graduating high school, I enrolled at Ohio State University to study business administration with a focus on hospitality management. My decision surprised some family members who questioned whether formal education was necessary for running a small restaurant, but Dad supported my choice, recognizing that the industry was becoming increasingly complex and competitive. The business program at Ohio State opened my eyes to possibilities I'd never considered while working within the familiar confines of our family operation. I learned about market analysis, competitive positioning, customer retention strategies, and financial management techniques that could transform a small business's growth trajectory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marketing classes taught me how to identify target demographics and develop promotional strategies that could attract new customers without alienating existing ones. Operations management courses provided frameworks for analyzing efficiency and implementing systematic improvements. But the most valuable education came from studying other successful restaurant operations during internships and case study projects. I worked summer positions at various establishments, a upscale bistro in Columbus, a fast casual chain location, and a farm-to-table restaurant that served an affluent suburban community. Each experience revealed different approaches to menu development, staff management, customer service, and operational efficiency. I began to understand that Thompson's family diner, while beloved locally, operated according to practices that were increasingly outdated in a rapidly evolving industry. My senior year project became an intensive analysis of our family business, examining every aspect of operations through the lens of modern restaurant management principles. I spent months collecting data, interviewing customers and employees, analyzing financial records, and benchmarking our performance against comparable establishments. The resulting report identified numerous opportunities for improvement, from upgrading our point-of-sale system to implementing inventory management software, from expanding our social media presence to developing strategic partnerships with local suppliers. The recommendations weren't radical departures from our core identity, but rather careful adaptations that could preserve Thompson's community-centered atmosphere while improving operational efficiency and financial performance. I proposed a phased implementation plan that would minimize disruption while systematically addressing the challenges that threatened our long-term viability. The research showed that restaurants similar to ours were succeeding by combining traditional values with contemporary practices, maintaining authentic character while embracing innovations that enhanced customer experience and business sustainability. When I presented my findings to Dad and David during Christmas break of my senior year, Their reactions crystallized the fundamental divide that would eventually tear our family apart. Dad listened thoughtfully, asked detailed questions about implementation costs and potential risks, and expressed genuine interest in exploring several of my suggestions. He particularly appreciated the customer feedback analysis, which revealed preferences and concerns that informal conversation had never uncovered. David's response was immediate and dismissive. He characterized my research as academic theory disconnected from practical reality, questioning whether my college professors understood the unique challenges of small-town restaurant management. According to his assessment, my recommendations would alienate loyal customers, confuse existing staff, and compromise the authentic atmosphere that made Thompson special. He argued that our steady profitability proved that current operations were successful, making change unnecessary and potentially destructive. The disagreement might have remained a respectful difference of opinion if market conditions hadn't begun shifting in ways that highlighted the urgency of adaptation. A new chain restaurant opened across town, offering modern amenities, extended hours, and competitive pricing that began attracting customers who had previously been Thompson's regulars. Online review platforms started influencing dining decisions, creating expectations for digital presence and contemporary service standards that we weren't meeting. Younger customers, particularly those with college education or urban experience, increasingly chose restaurants based on criteria that Thompson's traditional approach didn't address. Revenue began declining gradually but consistently throughout the spring following my graduation. The changes weren't dramatic enough to create immediate crisis, but the trend was unmistakable to anyone analyzing the data objectively. I documented the decline in detailed reports, correlating decreased sales with specific competitive factors and demographic shifts. My analysis showed that without strategic adaptation, Thompson's would face increasingly severe challenges as market dynamics continued evolving. David interpreted the revenue decline as temporary fluctuation caused by economic uncertainty and seasonal variation. He remained confident that our established customer base would return once novelty competitors proved unable to match our quality and service consistency. His faith in traditional approaches reflected genuine belief in the values that had sustained Thompson's for decades, but it also demonstrated resistance to acknowledging changes that threatened familiar patterns. Dad found himself caught between our competing perspectives during a period when his own health began creating additional stress. A minor heart episode in late spring required medical attention and temporary reduction in his work schedule, leaving David and me responsible for more operational decisions than ever before. The increased responsibility intensified our philosophical differences, transforming abstract disagreements about business strategy into concrete conflicts about daily management choices. Every decision became a battleground between innovation and tradition. When I suggested implementing online ordering to accommodate customer preferences, David argued that personal service was our competitive advantage. When I proposed updating our menu design to improve readability and highlight profitable items, David insisted that regulars preferred familiar formatting. When I recommended upgrading our scheduling software to reduce labor costs, David claimed that manual systems provided flexibility that computer programs couldn't match. The conflicts weren't simply professional disagreements. They reflected fundamentally different visions for Thompson's future and our respective roles within the family business. David viewed himself as the guardian of traditions that had made us successful, protecting established practices from unnecessary complications. I saw myself as the advocate for adaptations that would ensure our long-term survival, preparing the business for challenges that traditional methods couldn't address. Neither perspective was entirely wrong, but they were increasingly incompatible as market pressures demanded decisive action rather than prolonged debate. Every week of inaction made implementation more difficult as competitive disadvantages accumulated and customer expectations continued evolving. The paralysis created by our disagreement was becoming more damaging than either of our individual approaches would have been. The situation reached a breaking point in early fall when Dad's recovery required him to step back from day-to-day management entirely. For the first time in Thompson's history, the business needed to operate without the founder's direct involvement, creating a succession crisis that couldn't be postponed indefinitely. The decision about future leadership would determine not just operational philosophy, but the fundamental character of the enterprise that had defined our family identity for more than half a century. David moved quickly to consolidate his position, presenting Dad with arguments about continuity, experience, and customer relationships that emphasized his years of hands-on management over my recent education and analytical contributions. He framed the choice as a decision between proven reliability and risky experimentation, portraying himself as the safe option for preserving everything that made Thompson's valuable. My position was more complex because it required acknowledging that preservation through adaptation was possible, but not guaranteed. I couldn't promise that my recommendations would succeed without risk, only that avoiding change would eventually guarantee failure as market conditions continued shifting. The choice wasn't between safety and risk, but between different types of risk. The risk of changing too much versus the risk of changing too little. The family meeting that would decide Thompson's future took place on a gray October evening, after we'd closed for the day. Dad sat across from David and me in the booth, where we'd held countless family discussions over the years, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. The weight of choosing between his children's competing visions was clearly taking its toll, adding emotional stress to the physical challenges of his recovery. What none of us could have anticipated was how that evening's decision would set in motion a series of events that would transform not just Thompson's family diner, but our entire family dynamic in ways that would take years to fully understand. The silence in that booth stretched longer than any conversation we'd ever had at Thompson's. Dad's hands rested flat on the worn Formica table, fingers spread wide as if he were trying to anchor himself to something solid while the foundation of our family business shifted beneath us. Outside, the streetlights of Main Street flickered on against the October dusk, casting long shadows through the diner's windows and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the spaces between us. David broke the silence first, his voice carrying the weight of certainty that had always been his strongest asset, and I was beginning to realize his greatest limitation. He pulled out a manila folder that he'd obviously prepared in advance, filled with customer comment cards, employee schedules, and financial records that supported his argument for maintaining operational continuity. "Dad, I've been thinking about this conversation for months," he began, spreading the documents across the table with practiced efficiency. "Thompson's has been profitable for 60 years because we've never forgotten who we are or who we serve. Our customers don't come here for trendy menu items or fancy technology. They come here because this place represents something consistent and reliable in a world that changes too fast for most people to keep up with." He pointed to a stack of handwritten comment cards, many of them praising the diner's traditional atmosphere and familiar service. Mrs. Henderson, who'd been coming to Thompson since before I was born, had written about how much she appreciated that her coffee cup never went empty, and her waitress always remembered her grandchildren's names. Frank Morrison, the owner of Morrison's Hardware, had mentioned that Thompson's was the only place left in town where he could conduct business over a handshake and a cup of coffee, just like his father had done decades earlier. "These people aren't looking for innovation," David continued, his voice gaining strength as he warmed to his argument. "They're looking for preservation. They want to know that when everything else in their lives is uncertain, they can still walk into Thompson's and find exactly what they've always found here. That's not nostalgia, Dad. That's our competitive advantage." I watched our father's face as David spoke, recognizing the expression of someone who wanted desperately to believe that simple solutions could address complex problems. Dad had built his version of Thompson's by making careful, incremental improvements to Grandpa's original concept, never straying too far from proven formulas while adapting just enough to stay relevant. David's approach promised to continue that philosophy, offering the comfort of familiar strategies during a period when comfort felt more valuable than growth. But I also saw the subtle signs of doubt that Dad was trying to hide. The way his eyes occasionally drifted to the empty tables that should have been occupied during what used to be our busiest evening hours. The slight tension in his shoulders when David mentioned customer loyalty without acknowledging the customers we'd already lost to newer establishments across town. When David finished his presentation, Dad turned to me with an expression that managed to be both expectant and apologetic. He knew that my perspective would be more complex, less reassuring, and potentially more disruptive to the family harmony he valued above almost everything else. But he also knew that fairness required hearing both arguments before making a decision that would affect the next generation of Thompson family legacy. I had prepared my own materials, but instead of immediately launching into statistical analysis and competitive benchmarking, I decided to start with a story that would illustrate the stakes more clearly than any spreadsheet could convey. 2 weeks ago, I began, I was having lunch at Riverside Grill, that new place that opened in the shopping center near the highway. While I was waiting for my order, I overheard a conversation between two women I recognized: Jennifer Walsh, who used to work at the bank, and her daughter Sarah, who just graduated from high school. I paused, allowing the significance of these familiar names to register. Jennifer had been a regular at Thompson's for years, often bringing Sarah for weekend breakfast after church. They represented exactly the kind of multi-generational customer relationship that David considered our unshakable foundation. Jennifer was telling Sarah about how much she'd enjoyed coming to Thompson's when Sarah was younger, but that she'd discovered Riverside Grill offered better value for the money and more convenient online ordering for busy weekdays. Sarah mentioned that she'd tried to bring some friends to Thompson's after graduation, but they'd complained that our menu was too limited and our Wi-Fi was too slow for them to post photos on social media. The weight of this anecdote settled over the table like a heavy blanket. These weren't anonymous statistics or theoretical market trends. These were real people whose changing preferences were already affecting our revenue, regardless of our family's internal debates about adaptation versus tradition. David's absolutely right that our traditional customers value consistency, I continued, careful to acknowledge the validity of his concerns while building toward my own argument. But he's overlooking the fact that even traditional customers are being influenced by experiences they have at other restaurants. When they discover that online ordering makes their lives easier, or that updated payment systems reduce wait times, or that improved menu variety gives them more options for dietary restrictions, they don't automatically ignore those benefits, just because they have sentimental attachment to Thompson's. I opened my own folder, revealing not just financial projections and competitive analysis, but photographs I'd taken at successful family-owned restaurants in similar small towns across Ohio and Pennsylvania. During my college breaks, I'd made it a point to visit establishments that had managed to preserve authentic character while implementing strategic modernizations. "This is Miller's Family Kitchen in Granville," I said, pointing to photos of a diner that looked remarkably similar to Thompson's in terms of size and community role. They faced the exact same challenges we're facing 3 years ago: declining revenue, increased competition from chain restaurants, younger customers choosing other options. Instead of choosing between tradition and innovation, they found ways to strengthen tradition through selective innovation. The photographs showed how Miller's had preserved their vintage aesthetic while adding contemporary conveniences, updated seating that maintained the classic diner look but provided more comfort, digital ordering systems that didn't disrupt, the personal service experience, menu expansions that included healthier options alongside traditional favorites. Most importantly, they'd increased their revenue by 35% over 2 years, while maintaining the customer satisfaction ratings that had made them a local institution. The choice isn't between being Thompson's or being something completely different, I explained, spreading out more examples of successful adaptations. The choice is between being the best version of Thompson's we can become, or watching Thompson's slowly become irrelevant, because we refuse to acknowledge that. Even our most loyal customers are human beings whose needs and expectations evolve over time. Dad studied the photographs with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that had been troubling him for months. I could see him mentally comparing Miller's approach to the changes I'd been proposing, recognizing that strategic adaptation could preserve essential character while addressing competitive pressures that pure traditionalism couldn't counter. David's response was predictably skeptical, but I sensed an underlying uncertainty that hadn't been present in his earlier arguments. The photographic evidence of successful family restaurant modernization was harder to dismiss than abstract theories about market dynamics or customer behavior. Those places might work in their communities, he said, but Millfield isn't Granville. Our customers have different expectations, different relationships with our business. What works somewhere else might destroy what makes us special here. It was a reasonable objection, but it revealed the fundamental flaw in David's thinking, his assumption that preservation required stagnation, that protecting Thompson's identity meant freezing it in time rather than allowing it to grow in ways that honored its core values while addressing contemporary challenges. You're right that every community is different, I acknowledged. That's exactly why I spent so much time researching local preferences and analyzing our specific customer base. The recommendations I'm making aren't generic solutions copied from other restaurants. They're targeted adaptations designed specifically for Millfield's demographics and Thompson's established brand identity. I pulled out the most compelling piece of evidence I'd prepared, a detailed survey of current and former Thompson's customers that I'd conducted over the summer, gathering feedback through careful conversations, written questionnaires, and informal interviews with people throughout the community. The results were more nuanced than either David's optimistic assessments or my competitive concerns had suggested. Long-term customers did indeed value Thompson's traditional atmosphere and personal service, just as David had argued. But they also expressed frustration with specific operational limitations that were driving them to seek alternatives for certain occasions. The inability to place orders in advance for busy mornings, limited menu options for family members with dietary restrictions, outdated payment systems that created unnecessary delays during lunch rushes. More significantly, the survey revealed a generational divide that threatened Thompson's long-term sustainability. Customers over 50 remained strongly loyal, but their dining frequency was gradually declining due to health considerations and fixed incomes that made restaurant meals less frequent. Customers between 30 and 50 were increasingly choosing other establishments for family dining, business meals, and social gatherings, citing convenience factors and menu variety that Thompson's couldn't match. Customers under 30 rarely considered Thompson's at all, viewing it as a place for their parents' generation rather than a relevant option for their own social and dining needs. The loyalty David's counting on is real, I explained, pointing to specific survey responses that confirmed strong emotional connections to Thompson's among established customers. But it's concentrated in a demographic that's naturally decreasing, their restaurant spending over time. Meanwhile, the demographic groups that represent growth opportunities are choosing alternatives because we're not meeting their basic expectations for contemporary food service. The mathematical reality was stark but undeniable. Even if Thompson's retained every single customer over 50, natural demographic changes would reduce our core customer base by approximately 15% over the next 5 years. Without attracting younger customers and increasing frequency, among middle-aged families, revenue decline was inevitable, regardless of how successfully we maintained traditional operations. David stared at the survey results with the expression of someone confronting information that challenged fundamental beliefs. He'd built his entire professional identity around the assumption that excellent execution of proven methods would guarantee continued success. The possibility that external changes could undermine internal excellence was difficult to accept, because it suggested that hard work and good intentions might not be sufficient to preserve what he'd dedicated his adult life to protecting. Dad's reaction was more pragmatic. shaped by decades of experience with the constant adaptation required to maintain a small business in a changing economy. He'd witnessed other local establishments fail not because they lacked quality or character, but because they couldn't adjust quickly enough to shifting market conditions. The choice between his children's competing visions was becoming a choice, between comfortable decline and uncertain transformation. "Lisa's research is thorough," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of reluctant recognition. "But David's concerns about maintaining our identity are also valid. The question is whether we can implement changes without losing what makes Thompson special." It was an opening, but a narrow one. Dad was intellectually convinced that adaptation was necessary, but emotionally attached to minimizing risk and preserving family harmony. Any solution would need to address both strategic requirements and interpersonal dynamics. I had anticipated this moment and prepared what I hoped would be a compromise that honored both perspectives while providing a clear path forward. "What if we approach this as a pilot program rather than a permanent transformation?" I suggested. "We could implement a few key improvements on a trial basis, measuring their impact on both customer satisfaction and operational efficiency. If they work, we expand them. If they don't, we modify or eliminate them." The proposal included specific timelines, success metrics, and rollback procedures that would minimize risk while providing objective criteria for evaluating results. We could upgrade our point-of-sale system to improve payment processing without changing the customer-facing experience. We could expand menu options during off-peak hours while maintaining traditional offerings during busy periods. We could develop an online presence that complemented rather than replaced personal service. David remained skeptical, but I could see him considering the possibility that controlled experimentation might be preferable to continued revenue decline. The pilot program approach offered him the opportunity to be proven right if traditional methods ultimately proved more effective, while providing me with the chance to demonstrate that strategic adaptation could strengthen rather than weaken Thompson's community role. Dad seemed relieved to have discovered a potential middle ground that didn't require choosing definitively between his children's competing philosophies. The pilot program would allow gradual implementation with multiple opportunities to reassess and adjust course based on actual results rather than theoretical projections. But before anyone could formally agree to the compromise, David raised the concern that would ultimately destroy any possibility of collaborative family leadership. "Who would be responsible for managing these pilot programs?" he asked, his tone suggesting that he already suspected the answer would be unacceptable to him. "Because if Lisa's going to be implementing changes while I'm trying to maintain day-to-day operations, we're going to have constant conflicts about priorities and resource allocation." It was a legitimate operational question, but it revealed the deeper issue that no compromise could resolve: David's inability to accept shared authority with someone whose approach fundamentally differed from his own. He could tolerate my ideas being tested, but only if he retained ultimate control over their implementation and evaluation. "The pilot programs would need dedicated management," I replied, recognizing that we'd reached the point where honest acknowledgement of our incompatible working styles was unavoidable. Trying to implement systematic changes while managing day-to-day operations would probably guarantee failure for both objectives. Dad's expression shifted as he realized that our family's business succession crisis couldn't be resolved through compromise or gradual transition. The philosophical differences between David and me weren't just disagreements about strategy. They reflected fundamentally different understandings of leadership, change management, and the relationship between tradition and innovation. The choice he'd been hoping to avoid was the only choice available, selecting one approach over the other, knowing that the rejected alternative would create lasting family consequences that extended far beyond business operations. The October evening had grown cold while we'd been talking, and the diner's interior now felt both familiar and foreign, a place suspended between the past it had always represented and the future it might never reach. In a few minutes, Dad would make the decision that would determine not just Thompson's operational future, but the trajectory of relationships that had defined our family identity for as long as any of us could remember. What none of us understood that night was how the choice between preservation and adaptation would ultimately reveal strengths and weaknesses in each approach that would take years to fully manifest. The path Dad was about to choose would test assumptions about family loyalty, business success, and personal identity in ways that would transform all of us in directions we couldn't possibly anticipate. The weight of that impending decision hung in the air between us like the aroma of coffee and bacon that had always defined Thompson's atmosphere. Familiar and comforting, even as we prepared to discover whether familiarity and comfort would be sufficient to sustain us through the challenges that lay ahead. Dad's weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, the ceramic making a soft clink against the saucer in the growing silence. Through the diner's front windows, I could see the neon signs of competing restaurants glowing. In the distance, bright promises of convenience and modernity that seemed to mock our family's struggle to balance progress with preservation. The fluorescent lights above our booth hummed with the same frequency they'd maintained since my childhood, creating a soundtrack to countless family conversations that had never carried stakes this high. When Dad finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd spent weeks rehearsing words he'd hoped never to say. "I've been running this place for over 20 years, he began, his eyes fixed on the table rather than meeting either David's gaze or mine. "I've seen a lot of changes in this town, watched businesses come and go, seen families torn apart by disagreements about money and control and what the future should look like." He paused to take a sip of coffee that had grown cold during our lengthy discussion, wincing slightly at the bitter taste before continuing. "Your grandfather always told me that the most important decision a business owner makes isn't about menus or marketing or even money. It's about who you trust to carry forward what you've built, and whether you're willing to accept that they might do things differently than you would." David shifted in his seat, sensing that Dad's preamble was leading somewhere he might not want to follow. I remained still, trying to read the subtle expressions crossing our father's face as he wrestled with a choice that would define the remainder of his legacy and potentially reshape our family dynamics permanently. "David, you've been here every day for the past 7 years," Dad continued, finally looking up to meet my brother's eyes. "You know every aspect of our operations. You've earned the respect of our staff and customers, and you've proven that you can maintain the standards that make Thompson special. When I had my heart episode last spring, you stepped up without hesitation and kept everything running smoothly." I felt my stomach tighten as I recognized the direction of Dad's reasoning. The acknowledgement of David's contributions was both fair and ominous, suggesting that practical considerations were weighing more heavily than strategic vision in Dad's decision-making process. "Lisa, your research and analysis are impressive," Dad said, turning toward me with an expression that attempted to soften the rejection I could sense approaching. "You've identified real challenges that we need to address, and your ideas for improvement are thoughtful and well-researched. But implementing those changes would require the kind of full-time commitment and hands-on management that you can't provide while building your own career elsewhere." The logic was sound but incomplete, focusing on immediate operational requirements, while ignoring the long-term sustainability issues that had motivated my involvement in the first place. I wanted to argue that career flexibility could be negotiated, that strategic planning was more valuable than tactical familiarity, that the choice between us represented a choice between Thompson's past and its potential future. But I could see in Dad's posture that his decision had already crystallized, shaped by risk aversion and emotional comfort rather than analytical assessment. "I'm giving operational control to David," he announced with the finality of someone ending rather than beginning a conversation. "He'll have authority over daily management, staff decisions, menu planning, and financial oversight. Lisa, you're welcome to stay involved as a consultant or advisor, but major decisions will go through your brother." The words hung in the air like smoke from the grill, visible and choking. David's relief was immediately apparent in the way. His shoulders relaxed and his breathing deepened, while I felt the familiar sensation of doors closing on possibilities I'd worked years to create. The compromise Dad was offering, advisory involvement without executive authority, represented exactly the kind of tokenism that had driven me to seek independence in the first place. What does consultant or advisor mean, specifically? Asked, though I suspected the answer would confirm my fears about being marginalized within my own family's enterprise. Dad looked uncomfortable with the question, clearly hoping that vague titles would satisfy everyone without requiring detailed definition of roles and responsibilities. You could help with the business planning, maybe work on some of the improvement projects you've identified, provide input on major decisions. It was exactly what I'd expected. The appearance of involvement without actual authority. The opportunity to contribute ideas that David could implement, modify, or reject, according to his preferences. The arrangement would allow the family to claim that my education and insights were valued, while ensuring that nothing fundamental would change about Thompson's operational philosophy. Would I have budget authority for implementing improvements? I pressed, needing to understand whether Dad's offer had any substance beyond symbolic inclusion. The pause before Dad's response provided the answer before he spoke. Budget decisions would need David's approval, since he'll be responsible for overall financial management. David nodded, his expression suggesting that he viewed this arrangement as generous rather than restrictive. In his perspective, I would be free to propose whatever changes I thought necessary, while he retained the practical wisdom to evaluate their feasibility and potential impact on established operations. But I understood that this dynamic would create constant friction, with every suggestion requiring justification to someone who'd already demonstrated skepticism about the need for systematic change. The advisory role would position me as a perpetual outsider within my own family's business, offering recommendations that could be dismissed whenever they conflicted with traditional approaches. The silence that followed stretched longer than comfortable, filled with the weight of recognition that Dad's decision had resolved the immediate succession question while creating conditions that would make long-term collaboration impossible. David was trying to appear gracious in victory, while I was processing the realization that my years of preparation and analysis had been judged less valuable than seniority and operational familiarity. I need some time to consider whether that arrangement would be productive for anyone involved, I said finally, choosing my words carefully to avoid burning bridges while acknowledging that the offered role was fundamentally unacceptable. Dad's expression shifted to concern, recognizing that my diplomatic response masked serious reservations about the family business plan he'd just outlined. Lisa, I hope you'll at least try the arrangement before making any final decisions. This doesn't have to be an all-or-nothing situation. But that was exactly what it had become, despite everyone's preference for gradual transitions and compromise solutions. The choice between executive authority and advisory participation was indeed all or nothing, determining whether I would be an active leader in Thompson's future or a marginalized consultant whose expertise could be safely ignored, whenever it proved inconvenient. David finally spoke, his tone suggesting genuine desire for family harmony, even as he claimed the leadership position he'd always considered his birthright. Lisa, I value your ideas and I want your input on improving our operations. We can work together on this. The offer was well-intentioned, but revealed David's fundamental misunderstanding of what collaboration would require. He was proposing a hierarchical relationship disguised as partnership, expecting me to provide strategic thinking while accepting his authority to determine which strategies would be implemented. The arrangement might work if I shared his basic assumptions about change management and business development, but our philosophical differences made genuine collaboration impossible under those conditions. I appreciate that you want to work together, I replied, but I think we both know that our approaches to business development are too different for a hierarchical arrangement to be successful. We'd end up frustrated with each other and probably damage our family relationship in the process. It was a diplomatic way of acknowledging that David's victory in the succession struggle was also a recognition that my vision for Thompson's future was incompatible with continued family involvement. The choice Dad had made wasn't just about operational control. It was about the fundamental direction of the business and the role that innovation would play in its long-term strategy. Dad looked distressed by the implications of my response, clearly hoping that his carefully crafted compromise would preserve both family unity and business continuity. "Maybe we could establish a trial period," he suggested. "See how the arrangement works for 6 months, then reassess based on actual experience rather than theoretical concerns." The proposal was reasonable from his perspective, offering a face-saving mechanism that might allow time for emotions to cool and practical considerations to overcome philosophical differences. But I recognized that 6 months of advisory status would only confirm what was already apparent: that David and I had fundamentally different ideas about what Thompson's needed to survive and thrive in a changing market. More importantly, the trial period would require me to postpone other opportunities while participating in an arrangement that was designed to fail. David would have no incentive to implement suggestions that challenged his preferred methods, while I would have no authority to demonstrate the effectiveness of approaches he considered unnecessary or risky. "A trial period wouldn't change the basic dynamic," I explained. "Either David trusts my judgment enough to implement significant changes, or he doesn't. 6 months won't resolve that fundamental question about how much adaptation Thompson's needs." David's face reddened slightly, interpreting my response as criticism of his leadership capabilities rather than acknowledgement of our strategic differences. "I'm not opposed to all changes," he said defensively. "I just think we need to be careful about preserving what our customers value most about this place." It was a fair statement that revealed the core issue neither of us could resolve: the question of whether preservation required stagnation or could accommodate strategic evolution. David genuinely believed that maintaining Thompson's essential character meant minimizing changes that might confuse loyal customers or compromise service quality. I equally believed that preserving Thompson's community role required adapting to changing expectations and competitive pressures. Both perspectives had merit, but they led to incompatible operational decisions about everything from technology adoption to menu development to marketing strategy. The trial period Dad was proposing wouldn't resolve these differences. It would only postpone the moment when their incompatibility became undeniable. The conversation that followed revealed how deeply our disagreement extended beyond business. Strategy into questions of risk tolerance, change management, and the relationship between tradition and innovation. David cited examples of local businesses that had failed after attempting modernization efforts that alienated established customers. I countered with examples of family establishments that had thrived by updating operations while preserving authentic character. Neither of us was entirely wrong, but our selective evidence reflected different assumptions about what Thompson's customers actually wanted and how they would respond to various types of change. David's conservative approach might indeed preserve current customer relationships, but it would also limit growth opportunities and leave us vulnerable to competitive pressures. My adaptive approach might attract new customers and improve operational efficiency, but it could also create confusion or resentment among people who valued Thompson's precisely because it hadn't changed. The debate continued for another hour, covering familiar ground with increasing frustration, as we realized that no amount of discussion would bridge the gap between our fundamentally different worldviews. Dad's occasional attempts to find middle ground only highlighted how irreconcilable our positions had become. Finally, as the clock approached 10, and the diner's empty tables created an atmosphere of premature closure, I made the decision that had been building throughout the evening's conversation. "I think it's best if I step away from Thompson's entirely," I said, the words emerging with surprising clarity despite the emotional difficulty of speaking them. David should have complete authority to implement his vision without having to accommodate conflicting approaches, or justify decisions to someone who fundamentally disagrees with his methods. The stunned silence that followed my announcement was broken only by the hum of refrigeration units and the distant sound of traffic on Route 22. Dad looked stricken, as if he'd been hoping that his compromise solution would somehow preserve family involvement even while acknowledging its practical limitations. David appeared caught between relief at gaining uncontested control and concern about the family implications of my departure. "Lisa, you don't have to make that decision tonight," Dad said urgently. "This is an emotional situation, and permanent. Choices shouldn't be made when everyone's feeling stressed and disappointed." But I recognized that my decision wasn't emotional. It was logical, based on clear assessment of an untenable situation. Remaining involved in Thompson's under David's leadership would create ongoing conflict without productive resolution, while stepping away would allow both of us to pursue our respective visions without constant friction. "This isn't about emotion," I replied. "It's about recognizing that David and I have different ideas about what Thompson's needs, and that trying to combine those approaches would probably hurt the business and definitely damage our relationship." David nodded slowly, understanding that my departure would eliminate the source of tension that had complicated family dynamics for months. "I don't want this to affect our personal relationship," he said, though his tone suggested uncertainty about whether such separation was possible. It was a reasonable hope, but I suspected that business disagreements had already revealed deeper differences in our approaches to problem-solving, risk assessment, and change management that extended beyond restaurant operations. The process of working through Thompson's succession crisis had shown us aspects of each other's thinking that weren't easily overlooked or forgotten. "Our personal relationship doesn't have to be affected," I agreed, though I wasn't entirely confident about maintaining that separation. "We can respect each other's choices even when we disagree about methods and priorities." The remainder of our conversation focused on practical details, the timeline for my departure, the transfer of responsibilities I'd been handling, the communication strategy for explaining changes to staff and customers. Dad insisted on maintaining my minority ownership stake, arguing that family involvement shouldn't depend entirely on operational participation. I accepted the arrangement reluctantly, recognizing that complete financial separation might be unnecessarily punitive while hoping that ownership without management authority wouldn't create future complications. As we prepared to leave the diner that night, I took a final look around the dining room that had shaped my understanding of business, community, and family responsibility. The red vinyl booths, faded photographs, and worn linoleum flooring represented both the authenticity I'd wanted to preserve and the limitations I'd hoped to transcend. In a few days, Thompson's would continue operating according to David's traditional philosophy, while I would begin searching for opportunities to apply my business education and analytical skills in environments where adaptation was valued rather than feared. The drive home through Millfield's quiet streets provided time to process the finality of what had just occurred. Streetlights illuminated familiar landmarks: the hardware store where Dad bought supplies, the bank where Mom had worked before, retirement, the school where I'd first developed confidence in my ability to analyze complex problems and propose systematic solutions. Nothing in the physical environment had changed, but my relationship to all of it had been fundamentally altered by the evening's conversation. I was no longer a future leader of Thompson's family diner, heir to a business legacy that had defined our family identity for 3 generations. Instead, I was a recent college graduate with restaurant industry experience, analytical skills, and strategic vision that would need to find expression in contexts where innovation was encouraged rather than merely tolerated. The transition wouldn't be easy, either emotionally or practically. Leaving Thompson's meant abandoning not just a career path, but an identity that had shaped my goals and motivated my education for years. It also meant disappointing Dad's hopes for family continuity and accepting that my expertise wouldn't be valued in the context where I'd most wanted to apply it. But as I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home for what felt like the last time as a member of Thompson's management team, I also felt a surprising sense of relief. The months of conflict over business strategy had been emotionally exhausting, requiring constant justification of approaches that seemed obviously necessary to me, but unnecessarily risky to David. Stepping away would eliminate that friction while creating space to discover whether my ideas about restaurant management were actually effective when implemented without compromise or constant resistance. The next morning would begin a new chapter in my professional development, one that would test whether the analytical skills and strategic thinking I'd developed could succeed in competitive environments beyond the protective context of family, business. It would also reveal whether the confidence I'd gained through education and research could survive the rejection I'd experienced from the people whose approval had always mattered most. What I couldn't anticipate that night was how the decision to leave Thompson's would ultimately provide exactly the kind of independence and authority I'd been seeking, leading to opportunities that would exceed anything I could have achieved within the constraints of family business succession. The path forward would be more challenging than staying would have been, but it would also be entirely my own to create and navigate. The first 6 months after leaving Thompson's felt like living in a foreign country where I understood the language, but not the customs. I moved to Columbus with 2 suitcases, my business degree, and a determination that felt both fierce and fragile. The apartment I could afford was a cramped studio in a complex near Ohio State's campus, where the thin walls carried conversations in 3 different languages, and the parking lot served as a gathering place for students whose lives seemed infinitely more carefree than mine felt. My first job was at Riverside Restaurant Group, a regional chain that managed 14 locations across central Ohio. The corporate office occupied the 3rd floor of a glass building that smelled like carpet cleaner and ambition, where young professionals in identical business attire moved through cubicles with the focused energy of people climbing carefully constructed ladders toward predetermined destinations. As a management trainee, I earned $32,000 annually, while learning systems that made Thompson's operations look quaint by comparison. Everything was standardized, measured, and optimized for efficiency rather than personality. Food costs were tracked to the penny. Labor schedules were generated by algorithms that balanced customer traffic patterns with profit margins, and customer satisfaction was monitored through digital surveys that reduced complex dining experiences to numerical ratings. The work was intellectually engaging in ways that surprised me. Analyzing performance data across multiple locations revealed patterns that would have been invisible within a single establishment. I learned to identify operational inefficiencies that cost thousands of dollars annually, develop training programs that reduced staff turnover, and implement technology solutions that streamlined everything from inventory management to payroll processing. But the corporate environment also confirmed everything I'd valued about family restaurant culture. Employees were treated as interchangeable components rather than individual contributors. Customer relationships were managed through loyalty programs and promotional campaigns rather than personal recognition and genuine service. Decisions were made by committees in conference rooms, far removed from the daily realities of food preparation and customer interaction. The contrast became especially apparent during my rotational assignments at various Riverside locations. Managers who tried to create more personal atmospheres were consistently redirected toward corporate protocols. Servers who developed genuine relationships with regular customers were praised for their friendliness, but discouraged from deviating from standardized service scripts. Kitchen staff who suggested menu improvements were politely thanked and ignored. I excelled within this system because my analytical skills were perfectly suited to corporate restaurant management. Within 8 months, I was promoted to assistant regional manager, responsible for supporting 12 locations and their individual management teams. The promotion came with a salary increase to $41,000 and a company car that made my commute to various properties more efficient. The success felt hollow in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every process improvement I implemented made operations more efficient but less human. Every cost reduction I identified eliminated someone's job or reduced service quality in subtle but meaningful ways. The analytical thinking that I'd hoped would enhance restaurant experiences was instead being used to maximize profits through systematic removal of everything that made dining memorable rather than merely functional. Meanwhile, news from Millfield arrived through carefully neutral phone calls with my parents and occasional text messages from David. Thompson's was maintaining steady operations under his leadership, though revenue growth remained flat despite his efforts to boost customer satisfaction through traditional approaches. He'd upgraded some equipment and improved staff training, but the fundamental challenges I'd identified continued affecting long-term sustainability. The local newspaper featured a brief article about Thompson's 60th anniversary celebration, highlighting the diner's role in community history and David's commitment to preserving family traditions. Reading the article from my Columbus apartment, I felt a complex mixture of nostalgia, vindication, and loss. Thompson's was surviving without my involvement, but it wasn't thriving in ways that would ensure another 60 years of operation. My parents visited Columbus twice during my first year away, awkward dinners at chain restaurants where we carefully avoided discussing business strategy or family dynamics. They expressed polite interest in my corporate career while clearly hoping that distance and time would eventually lead to reconciliation and my return to Millfield. I appreciated their concern while recognizing that the path I'd chosen was becoming more permanent with each passing month. The turning point came during my second year at Riverside, when I was assigned to analyze the performance of a struggling location in a suburb that reminded me of Millfield. The restaurant occupied a converted house with architectural charm that corporate renovation had systematically eliminated in favor of brand consistency. Sales were declining, customer complaints were increasing, and the management team seemed demoralized by their inability to meet performance standards designed for newer, more efficiently designed locations. Spending 3 weeks at this location, I observed dynamics that crystallized everything I'd been learning about the difference between operational efficiency and authentic hospitality. The building's layout created service bottlenecks that standardized procedures couldn't address. The menu offerings didn't match local preferences that had developed around the area's demographic and cultural characteristics. Most significantly, corporate policies prevented the kind of community engagement that could have differentiated this location from numerous competitors. My analysis identified specific recommendations that could improve performance through strategic adaptation rather than continued standardization. Modifying the physical layout to accommodate natural traffic flow, adjusting menu offerings to reflect local preferences, and training staff to develop genuine relationships with neighborhood customers could transform this struggling location into a profitable community gathering place. When I presented these findings to regional management, the response was predictably corporate. My analysis was praised for its thoroughness, but implementation was rejected because it would require deviation from established brand standards. The recommendation was to close the location and redirect resources toward properties that could succeed within existing operational frameworks. Watching that restaurant close 6 months later, I realized that my analytical skills were being wasted in an environment that valued consistency over adaptation. The strategic thinking that could have saved jobs and preserved community resources was being filtered through corporate priorities that treated local authenticity as a liability rather than an asset. That recognition prompted me to begin exploring alternatives that would allow application of business analysis within contexts that valued innovation rather than merely tolerating it. I started networking with independent restaurant owners, attending industry conferences focused on hospitality entrepreneurship, and researching successful small business models that combined operational efficiency with authentic community engagement. The opportunity that changed everything emerged through a conversation with Margaret Hoffman, a former Riverside executive who had left corporate management to open her own restaurant in Columbus's emerging Short North District. We met at a coffee shop near the convention center after an industry networking event, where she described her vision for a neighborhood bistro that would combine professional kitchen management, with the kind of personal atmosphere that chain restaurants couldn't replicate. Margaret had secured funding and identified a location, but she needed an operations partner who understood both corporate efficiency and independent restaurant culture. My background made me an ideal candidate for developing systems that would ensure profitability while preserving the authentic character that would differentiate her concept from surrounding competitors. The partnership she proposed was exactly what I'd been seeking without quite realizing it. The opportunity to apply strategic business analysis within an environment that valued innovation, community engagement, and operational excellence. Unlike my advisory role at Thompson's, this collaboration would provide complete authority over systems development, staff training, and performance optimization. Leaving Riverside felt like stepping out of a comfortable prison. The corporate job provided security, predictable advancement, and valuable experience. But it also limited my potential impact to optimizing systems that prioritized profit over purpose. Margaret's offer represented significant financial risk, a substantial salary reduction in exchange for equity participation, and the chance to build something meaningful rather than merely managing existing operations. The decision required careful financial planning and considerable courage, but it also felt like the natural evolution of everything I'd been learning since leaving Thompson's. My education and corporate experience had prepared me to succeed as an independent restaurant professional, while my family background had taught me to value authentic hospitality over standardized service. Rosemary and Thyme opened 8 months later in a converted row house that perfectly captured the neighborhood bistro atmosphere Margaret had envisioned. Our menu featured locally sourced ingredients prepared with techniques I'd learned from corporate kitchen management, while our service style emphasized personal attention and community connection that chains couldn't match. The operational systems I developed combined efficiency with flexibility, allowing consistent quality control while accommodating the kind of special requests and personal preferences that transformed customers into regulars. Staff training focused on genuine hospitality rather than scripted interactions, creating an atmosphere where employees felt empowered to exceed expectations rather than merely following protocols. Within 6 months, Rosemary and Thyme was generating revenues that exceeded our most optimistic projections. Online reviews consistently praised both food quality and service excellence, while our reservation system was regularly booked 3 weeks in advance for weekend dining. Local food critics featured our farm-to-table approach and innovative seasonal menu development as exemplary of Columbus's emerging culinary scene. The success validated everything I'd believed about strategic restaurant management. That operational efficiency and authentic character could be combined through careful system design, that innovation could enhance rather than compromise traditional hospitality values, and that analytical thinking could improve rather than diminish dining experiences when applied with appropriate priorities. More importantly, the partnership with Margaret provided exactly the kind of professional fulfillment I'd been seeking. Every operational improvement we implemented made the restaurant more successful while also enhancing employee satisfaction and customer experience. Strategic decisions were made collaboratively by people who understood both business requirements and hospitality values, rather than by distant committees focused exclusively on financial metrics. The restaurant's success led to expansion opportunities that we approached with the same combination of analytical rigor and authentic vision that had made our initial concept successful. Our second location opened 2 years later in a different Columbus neighborhood, featuring adapted systems that preserved our operational excellence while reflecting local preferences and demographic characteristics. By the 4th year, Rosemary and Thyme had become a recognized brand within Columbus's restaurant community, generating annual revenues that provided comfortable livings for both Margaret and me, while employing 43 people across 2 locations. Food industry publications featured our business model as an example of how independent restaurants could compete successfully with corporate chains through strategic innovation and community engagement. The professional recognition felt gratifying, But more meaningful was the realization that I'd created exactly the kind of career I'd envisioned during those frustrating conversations at Thompson's. My business education and analytical skills were being applied in an environment that valued strategic thinking, while my family restaurant background informed approaches that prioritized authentic hospitality over generic efficiency. During the 5th year of Rosemary and Thyme's operation, I received a call that brought the story full circle in ways I couldn't have imagined. David's voice carried strain that I hadn't heard since Dad's heart attack, immediately signaling that our conversation wouldn't be the casual family update I'd been expecting. Thompson's family diner was in serious financial trouble. The combination of increased competition, changing customer preferences, and operational challenges that traditional management couldn't address had created a crisis that threatened the business's survival. David had exhausted conventional solutions and was now facing the possibility of bankruptcy or forced sale to corporate buyers who would eliminate Thompson's community role entirely. "Lisa," he said, after explaining the situation with characteristic directness, "I need to ask for your help, not as my sister, but as someone who understands restaurant turnaround strategies." The irony was profound and painful. The analytical skills he'd rejected 5 years earlier were now Thompson's best hope for survival, while the traditional approaches he'd defended had proved insufficient to address competitive pressures that my research had accurately predicted. But rather than feeling vindicated, I felt genuinely concerned about the possibility of losing Thompson's as a community institution. Despite our disagreements about operational philosophy, I recognized the diner's value as a gathering place that provided something corporate restaurants couldn't replicate: authentic local character that connected people to their community's history and identity. The consultation I provided over the following months allowed me to apply everything I'd learned about restaurant turnaround strategies within the context where my expertise was most personally meaningful. Working with David, I developed implementation plans that preserved Thompson's essential character while addressing the operational deficiencies that threatened its sustainability. The improvements we made together were more successful than either of us had anticipated, demonstrating that our competing approaches could be complementary rather than contradictory when applied with mutual respect and shared commitment to Thompson's survival. Strategic innovation enhanced rather than compromised the traditional values that made Thompson special, while operational efficiency improved rather than diminished the personal service that customers valued most. But the most significant outcome wasn't Thompson's improved performance. It was the restoration of my relationship with David and my family. Working together toward a common goal revealed that our disagreements had been about methods rather than values, timing rather than priorities. We both wanted Thompson's to succeed as a community institution, but we'd had different ideas about how to achieve that goal. 6 months later, when a corporate restaurant group offered to purchase Thompson's at a price that would provide comfortable retirement for Dad and financial security for David, the decision required signatures from all family members with ownership stakes. The irony was exactly what I'd imagined during those frustrating conversations years earlier. David needed my approval for a transaction that would end Thompson's independent operation. But by then, our relationship had evolved beyond the competitive dynamics that had made collaboration impossible. The consultation experience had demonstrated that both traditional and innovative approaches had value when applied appropriately, while my success with Rosemary and Thyme had proved that my departure from Thompson's had benefited everyone involved. I signed the sale documents willingly, recognizing that Thompson's had served its purpose in our family's story, and that its legacy would continue through the lessons we'd all learned about business, family, and the relationship between tradition and change. David used his portion of the sale proceeds to start a restaurant management consulting business, applying his operational expertise to help other family establishments navigate succession challenges and competitive pressures. The experience taught me that vindication isn't about proving others wrong. It's about proving yourself right through sustained commitment to authentic goals. David hadn't been wrong to value Thompson's traditions, just as I hadn't been wrong to advocate for strategic adaptation. We'd both been partially right about what Thompson's needed, but completely wrong about our inability to work together toward solutions that honored both perspectives. Today, I own 3 successful restaurants across Ohio, employing over 60 people and generating sufficient revenue to support expansion into neighboring states. The business cards in my wallet identify me as Chief Executive Officer of Thompson Hospitality Group, a name that honors both my partnership with Margaret and my family heritage, while representing something entirely new that emerged from the combination of both influences. The analytical skills that David once dismissed as impractical theories have created opportunities that exceeded anything I could have achieved within Thompson's traditional structure. But those same skills were informed by values I learned in my family's diner: the importance of treating employees as individuals rather than interchangeable resources, the value of genuine service over scripted efficiency, and the recognition that successful restaurants serve communities rather than merely feeding customers. The journey from that painful family meeting to this moment of professional fulfillment required leaving behind the security of established expectations and accepting responsibility for creating something entirely my own. It demanded persistence through setbacks, confidence during uncertainty, and the willingness to risk failure in pursuit of authentic success. But most importantly, it required understanding that family relationships and business partnerships serve different purposes, that professional disagreements don't have to create personal animosity, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give the people we love is the space to discover what they're truly capable of achieving when they're free to define success according to their own values and vision. The morning David called me about the sale papers, I was standing in the kitchen of what would become my 5th restaurant location, watching contractors install equipment that represented everything I'd learned about combining efficiency with authenticity. The space hummed with possibility: exposed brick walls that would showcase local artwork, an open kitchen design that would let customers see their meals being prepared with care, and a layout that encouraged both intimate conversations and community gatherings. My phone buzzed with David's name, and for a moment I hesitated before answering. Our conversations had become more frequent since I'd helped Thompson's through its crisis, but they still carried an undercurrent of careful navigation around topics that could resurrect old conflicts. His voice, when I finally picked up, carried a tension that immediately transported me back to those difficult family meetings years earlier. "Lisa, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," he began, though something in his tone suggested that what he needed to discuss would take precedence over whatever I might be doing. "Just reviewing kitchen layouts," I replied, setting down the blueprint I'd been studying. "What's going on?" There was a pause that stretched long enough for me to recognize that David was struggling with how to frame whatever conversation he'd called to initiate. Through the restaurant's front windows, I could see Columbus morning traffic building toward the rush hour intensity that would soon fill the streets with people heading to jobs they'd chosen, careers they'd built, lives they'd constructed according to their own definitions of success and fulfillment. "We got an offer," David said finally. "A good offer, better than anything we expected." I didn't need him to specify what kind of offer he meant. For months, we'd been discussing the possibility that Thompson's improved performance might attract buyers interested in the property, location, or established customer base. The consultation work I'd provided had stabilized operations and restored profitability, but it had also highlighted how much investment would be required to position the diner for long-term sustainability in an increasingly competitive market. "How good?" I asked, though I suspected the financial details mattered less than the emotional implications of whatever decision David was contemplating. "Good enough that Dad could retire comfortably and I could start over with something that fits my skills better," he replied. "It's from Heartland Restaurant Group. They want to keep the Thompson name and maintain some of the traditional menu items, but they'd renovate completely and integrate it into their family dining concept." I understood immediately what this meant. Heartland was a regional chain that specialized in acquiring established local restaurants, preserving their nostalgic appeal while implementing corporate systems that maximized efficiency and profitability. Thompson's would survive as a brand, but not as the independent family business that had defined our community role for 60 years. "What do you think about it?" I asked, genuinely curious about David's perspective on a decision that would end our family's restaurant legacy while potentially providing financial security that traditional operation couldn't guarantee. "Honestly?" David's voice carried a weariness that spoke to years of struggling with challenges that had no perfect solutions. "I think it might be the right choice for everyone involved. Dad's 73 and shouldn't be worrying about cash, flow, and equipment repairs. I'm tired of fighting market forces that I don't fully understand. And the offer would give all of us options we wouldn't have if we kept trying to make Thompson's work as an independent operation." It was a pragmatic assessment that reflected genuine understanding of the limitations that had made collaboration between us so difficult. David had always been most comfortable when he could focus on operational excellence within established parameters, rather than constantly adapting to changing competitive pressures and evolving customer expectations. The corporate acquisition would provide exactly that kind of stable environment while relieving him of strategic responsibilities that had never matched his natural strengths. "But," David continued, and I could hear the complication approaching in his tone, "the sale requires signatures from all family ownership stakeholders, including you." There it was, the irony that would have felt like vindication 5 years earlier, but now felt more like an opportunity for closure. The signature that David needed represented not just legal authorization, but acknowledgement that my departure from Thompson's had been the right decision for everyone involved. My success with Rosemary and Thyme had proven that my analytical skills and strategic vision were valuable when applied in appropriate contexts, while David's management of Thompson's had demonstrated his operational competence within traditional frameworks. "I'll need to review the offer documents," I said. "But if you think it's the right decision, I'm inclined to support it." The relief in David's voice was immediately apparent. "Really? You're not going to argue that we should keep trying to make the independent operation work?" It was a fair question that revealed how much our relationship had evolved since those confrontational family meetings. The David who had rejected my ideas about strategic adaptation would never have expected me to support a decision that validated his assessment of Thompson's limitations. But our collaboration during the crisis had taught both of us that disagreement about methods didn't require conflict about goals. "David, you've spent the past 5 years learning what works and what doesn't for Thompson's in the current market," I replied. "I trust your judgment about what's sustainable and what isn't. If you think the sale is the best option, then it probably is." The conversation that followed revealed how much both of our perspectives had matured through the experience of pursuing our respective strengths in appropriate contexts. David had discovered that his passion for food service was strongest when he could focus on operational excellence rather than strategic innovation, while I had learned that my analytical skills were most valuable when applied to businesses that encouraged rather than merely tolerated systematic improvement. We spent an hour discussing the practical implications of the sale, the timeline for completing the transaction, the transition plan for existing employees, the communication strategy for informing customers and community members about Thompson's change in ownership. These details required the same kind of careful coordination that had made our recent collaboration successful, demonstrating that we could work together effectively when our roles were clearly defined and mutually respected. The offer documents arrived by email that afternoon, providing financial terms that exceeded what any of us had considered realistic for a small-town diner with aging infrastructure and limited growth potential. Heartland's valuation reflected not just Thompson's current revenue, but the strategic value of its location, established customer relationships, and community recognition that would support their expansion into markets similar to Millfield. Reading through the acquisition terms, I was struck by how thoroughly the corporate approach differed from everything I'd valued about family restaurant culture. Heartland's operational plans called for standardized menu offerings, centralized purchasing systems, and service protocols that would eliminate most of the personal touches that had made Thompson's special. The efficiency gains would probably improve profitability, but they would also transform Thompson's into something fundamentally different from what our grandfather had created. Yet I also recognized that this transformation might be exactly what was needed to ensure that some version of Thompson's survived in a market that increasingly favored corporate operations over independent establishments. Heartland's resources and expertise could address infrastructure challenges and competitive pressures that family management couldn't overcome, preserving Thompson's community presence even if its character would inevitably change. The decision to sign felt both significant and anticlimactic. Significant because it represented the formal end of our family's restaurant legacy, but anticlimactic because that ending had become inevitable once we'd acknowledged that continued independent operation wasn't sustainable. My signature on the sale documents was less about choosing Thompson's future than about accepting the reality that market forces had already determined. I signed the papers on a quiet Thursday morning in my office above Rosemary and Time's original location, surrounded by the financial reports, operational manuals, and strategic planning documents that represented everything I'd learned about successful restaurant management since leaving Thompson's. The contrast between my current professional environment and the cramped office behind Thompson's kitchen, where Dad had managed the diner's finances, couldn't have been starker. The sale proceeds provided each family member with financial security that independent restaurant operation could never have guaranteed. Dad's portion would fund a comfortable retirement supplemented by the Social Security benefits he'd earned through decades of hard work. David's share would support his transition into restaurant consulting, applying his operational expertise to help other family businesses navigate challenges similar to those that had ultimately led to Thompson's sale. My portion of the sale represented a substantial addition to the investment capital I'd been accumulating for expansion of the Hoffman-Thompson Hospitality Group. The irony wasn't lost on me that Thompson's sale would fund the growth of restaurant concepts that embodied everything I'd wanted to implement at the family business: strategic innovation combined with authentic hospitality, operational efficiency that enhanced rather than compromised personal service, and community engagement that created genuine relationships rather than merely transactional interactions. The closing took place 6 weeks later in a conference room at Heartland's regional headquarters, a modern office building that could have housed any type of corporate operation, rather than specifically supporting restaurant management. David, Dad, and I sat across from Heartland executives who treated the acquisition as a routine business transaction, rather than the end of a family legacy that had shaped our community for 3 generations. The Heartland representatives were professional and respectful, acknowledging Thompson's historical significance while outlining renovation plans that would modernize operations and expand customer capacity. Their enthusiasm for the project was genuine, reflecting confidence that Thompson's location and established reputation would support profitable operation within their corporate framework. But I also sensed that they understood Thompson's value primarily in terms of market positioning and competitive advantage, rather than as a community institution that had provided gathering space and social connectivity for families across multiple generations. Their success metrics focused on revenue growth and operational efficiency, important objectives that nonetheless missed much of what had made Thompson's meaningful to people whose lives had been shaped by conversations that happened over coffee and pie in our red vinyl booths. After the paperwork was completed and ownership officially transferred, the 3 of us stood in the parking lot outside Heartland's offices, processing the finality of what had just occurred. Dad looked relieved, but also melancholy, like someone who had successfully completed a difficult task while recognizing that completion marked the end of an important chapter in his life. David seemed more energized than I'd seen him in years, already discussing his plans for the consulting business and the types of family restaurants he hoped to help navigate succession challenges similar to ours. The sale had freed him from responsibilities that had never suited his temperament while providing capital and credibility that would support work more aligned with his natural strengths. For me, the moment felt like closure rather than loss. Thompson's had served its purpose in our family's story, providing the foundation of values and experience that had shaped all of our subsequent choices. The diner's legacy would continue through the lessons we'd learned about business, family, and the relationship between tradition and innovation, even if those lessons were now being applied in different contexts. The drive back to Columbus gave me time to reflect on how completely my life had changed since that painful family meeting 5 years earlier. The young woman who had left Thompson's with hurt feelings and uncertain prospects had evolved into an experienced restaurant executive with multiple successful locations and expansion opportunities that would have seemed impossible during those difficult months after college graduation. More importantly, the experience had taught me that professional fulfillment comes not from proving others wrong, but from discovering contexts where your capabilities can create value for people who appreciate what you have to offer. David hadn't been wrong to prioritize Thompson's traditional values, just as I hadn't been wrong to advocate for strategic adaptation. We'd both been right about different aspects of restaurant management, but wrong about our ability to integrate those approaches within a single operation. The success of Rosemary and Thyme and its subsequent locations had vindicated my belief that analytical thinking could enhance rather than compromise authentic hospitality when applied with appropriate priorities. Every operational improvement we'd implemented had made our restaurants more efficient, while also creating better experiences for both employees and customers. Strategic innovation had strengthened rather than weakened our community connections, proving that change and preservation could be complementary rather than contradictory when guided by clear values and careful planning. But the most valuable lesson had been learning that family relationships and business partnerships serve different purposes, requiring different skills and creating different obligations. My relationship with David had improved dramatically once we'd stopped trying to work together professionally and started supporting each other's independent success. We could now appreciate each other's strengths without feeling threatened by our different approaches to problem-solving and decision-making. 6 months after Thompson's sale, I received a call from David asking for advice about a consulting project with a family restaurant in Toledo, whose succession challenges reminded him of our own experience. The conversation was professional rather than personal, focused on analytical frameworks and implementation strategies rather than family dynamics or emotional resolution. Yet something about the ease of our collaboration suggested that we'd finally found the working relationship that had eluded us during our time at Thompson's. David's operational expertise and my strategic analysis were complementary when applied to projects where our roles were clearly defined and our objectives were aligned. We could work together effectively as professional colleagues, even though we couldn't function as business partners. The restaurant David was consulting with eventually became a client of the Hoffman-Thompson Hospitality Group, implementing operational systems I'd developed while preserving family traditions that David helped them identify and strengthen. The collaboration demonstrated that our different approaches to restaurant management were more valuable when combined strategically rather than integrated operationally. Today, 3 years after Thompson's sale, I own 5 successful restaurant locations across Ohio and Western Pennsylvania, employing over 90 people and generating annual revenues that support both comfortable living and continued expansion. The business model we've developed combines corporate-level operational efficiency with independent restaurant authenticity, creating dining experiences that satisfy both practical and emotional customer needs. David's consulting practice has grown to serve family restaurants throughout the Midwest, helping them navigate succession planning, operational improvement, and strategic adaptation without losing the personal character that makes them community institutions. His expertise in traditional restaurant management, combined with insights gained from Thompson's transformation, provides valuable guidance for businesses facing similar challenges. The Heartland renovation of Thompson's was completed 18 months ago, creating a restaurant that bears our family name while operating according to corporate protocols that would have been unrecognizable to Grandpa Thompson. The new version serves more customers and generates higher profits, but it no longer functions as the community gathering place that had defined its role for 60 years. Local residents have mixed reactions to the changes. Some appreciate the improved efficiency, expanded menu options, and updated facilities that corporate investment made possible. Others miss the personal atmosphere and informal social connections that corporate service standards have necessarily eliminated. Both perspectives are valid, reflecting different priorities about what restaurants should provide beyond food and basic service. My own feelings about the transformation are similarly complex. I'm grateful that some version of Thompson's continues operating in Millfield, preserving employment opportunities and maintaining a dining option that serves community needs. But I also recognize that the Thompsons my grandfather built no longer exists, except in the memories of people who experienced it and the values it instilled in family members who carry those lessons forward in different contexts. The story that began with my painful departure from Thompson's has evolved into something more nuanced than simple vindication or family reconciliation. It's become a demonstration that success can take multiple forms, that different approaches to the same challenges can all have value when applied appropriately, and that sometimes the greatest gift family members can give each other is permission to pursue their authentic strengths without feeling obligated to conform to predetermined expectations. The analytical skills that David once dismissed have created opportunities that exceed anything I could have achieved within Thompson's traditional structure. But those opportunities emerged from values I learned in our family's diner: the importance of treating people with genuine care, the value of community connection, and the recognition that successful businesses serve purposes beyond mere profit. Generation. The journey required leaving behind the security of established expectations and accepting responsibility for creating something entirely new. It demanded persistence through uncertainty, confidence during setbacks, and the wisdom to recognize that authentic success means building something meaningful rather than simply proving others wrong. Most importantly, it taught me that vindication isn't about forcing others to acknowledge your worth. It's about creating value that speaks for itself, maintaining relationships that honor different perspectives, and building something substantial, enough to support not just your own dreams, but opportunities for others to discover and develop their own unique capabilities. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 years after Thompson's sale, delivered to my corporate office in downtown Columbus, where I now managed operations for 7 restaurant locations across 3 states. The envelope bore the distinctive letterhead of the James Beard Foundation, and my assistant had marked it as urgent despite its appearance among the usual stack of vendor invoices and industry publications that filled my daily correspondence. Inside was an invitation that represented recognition I'd never imagined pursuing when I first left Millfield with wounded pride and uncertain prospects. The foundation was nominating me for their Outstanding Restaurateur Award, citing my contributions to sustainable hospitality practices and innovative approaches to community-centered dining experiences. The nomination highlighted how Hoffman-Thompson Hospitality Group had demonstrated that regional restaurant operations could achieve both financial success and meaningful social impact through strategic business practices that prioritized employee welfare and local economic development. Reading the nomination letter, I was struck by how the language described achievements that had emerged naturally from values I'd learned at Thompson's Family Diner, even though those values had been applied in contexts my family's business could never have supported. The analytical frameworks and operational systems that had created our success were sophisticated applications of basic principles about treating people well, serving communities authentically, and building sustainable enterprises that could weather economic uncertainties through diversified revenue streams and strong stakeholder relationships. The timing of the recognition felt particularly meaningful because it arrived during a period when I was contemplating the next phase of expansion for our restaurant group. We had received inquiries from investors interested in franchising our concept nationally, proposals that would provide substantial capital for rapid growth while potentially diluting the local focus and authentic character that had made our establishments successful in regional markets. The franchise opportunity represented exactly the kind of choice that had divided David and me during our conflicts at Thompson's: the tension between scaling successful operations and preserving the personal elements that made those operations meaningful. Corporate franchising could transform our 7-location regional business into a national brand with hundreds of outlets, generating wealth that would exceed anything I'd envisioned when I first left my family's diner. But the franchise model would also require standardization that might eliminate the community-specific adaptations that had become our competitive advantage. Each of our current locations had developed unique characteristics that reflected local preferences, cultural traditions, and demographic patterns, creating dining experiences that felt authentic to their particular communities rather than generic applications of corporate formulas. The decision required careful analysis of whether our business model could maintain its essential character while achieving the scale that national expansion would demand. Unlike corporate chains that succeeded through consistency across diverse markets, our approach depended on flexibility and local responsiveness that might be incompatible with franchise requirements for operational uniformity and brand standardization. The deliberation process consumed months of strategic planning, financial modeling, and stakeholder consultation that drew on every analytical skill I developed since leaving Thompson's. We engaged franchise consultants, conducted market research, and analyzed successful restaurant groups that had navigated similar expansion decisions with varying degrees of success. The research revealed that franchise growth often created wealth for founders while transforming their concepts into something fundamentally different from the original vision that had made expansion possible. Many restaurateurs who had achieved national recognition through authentic local operations found that franchise requirements gradually eroded the very characteristics that had attracted investors in the first place. But the analysis also identified examples of restaurant groups that had managed to preserve their essential character while achieving sustainable growth through careful franchise partner selection and comprehensive training programs that transmitted values as well as operational procedures. These successful expansions required maintaining founder involvement in strategic decisions rather than simply licensing brand names and operational systems to independent operators. The solution we eventually developed reflected everything I learned about balancing innovation with preservation, growth with authenticity, and strategic ambition with operational reality. Instead of traditional franchising, we created a partnership model that provided expansion capital while maintaining corporate oversight of core business practices and community engagement standards. Our expansion partners would receive comprehensive training, ongoing operational support, and access to our supply chain relationships. But they would also be required to demonstrate commitment to the local focus and employee-centered practices that defined our brand identity. Each new location would adapt our basic concept to local preferences while maintaining quality standards and community engagement principles that ensured consistency of values rather than merely consistency of appearance. The partnership approach attracted investors who shared our priorities about sustainable business practices and authentic hospitality, rather than those primarily interested in maximizing short-term returns through rapid scaling. The screening process eliminated candidates who viewed restaurants as financial investments rather than community institutions, ensuring that expansion would strengthen rather than compromise our brand integrity. Implementation of the partnership model began with 3 carefully selected markets where demographic research indicated strong potential for our community-centered approach. Each location required 6 months of preparation, including partner training, staff recruitment, supplier identification, and marketing campaigns that introduced our concept while highlighting local connections and community partnerships. The success of these initial expansions validated our approach to growth that preserved essential character while achieving meaningful scale. Customer satisfaction ratings exceeded those of comparable establishments. Employee retention rates outperformed. Industry averages and financial performance met projections that had been considered optimistic during our planning phases. More importantly, each new location developed its own distinctive personality that reflected local culture while maintaining the core values and operational excellence that defined our brand. The adaptability that had made our original locations successful proved to be scalable when supported by comprehensive training and ongoing oversight that transmitted principles rather than merely procedures. 6 months after the Beard Foundation nomination, I received notification that I had been selected as the award recipient, recognizing achievements that had begun with my departure from Thompson's and evolved through years of learning how to apply analytical thinking within contexts that valued innovation and authentic hospitality. The award ceremony took place in Chicago, surrounded by culinary professionals whose accomplishments represented diverse approaches to restaurant excellence and community engagement. The recognition felt significant, not because it validated my choices, but because it demonstrated that business success and social impact could be achieved simultaneously through strategic approaches that prioritized stakeholder welfare alongside financial performance. During the acceptance speech, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had led from painful family conflicts to national recognition for restaurant leadership. The analytical skills that David had once dismissed as impractical had created opportunities that exceeded anything possible within traditional family business structures. While the values I'd learned at Thompson's had informed every decision, that made those opportunities meaningful. But the most important lesson hadn't been about business strategy or operational excellence. It had been about the importance of finding contexts where individual strengths could create value for others, rather than forcing compatibility between different approaches that served the same general objectives through incompatible methods. The success of Hoffman-Thompson Hospitality Group had emerged from applying innovative thinking within an industry that appreciated strategic improvement, just as David's consulting practice had flourished by applying traditional operational expertise to family businesses that needed guidance about preserving authentic character while adapting to changing market conditions. Neither approach was inherently superior, but they required different organizational contexts and stakeholder relationships to achieve their full potential. The conflict at Thompson's hadn't been about right versus wrong strategies, but about the impossibility of integrating fundamentally different philosophies within a single operation without compromising the effectiveness of both. Following the award ceremony, I was invited to speak at restaurant industry conferences and business schools, sharing insights about sustainable growth strategies and the integration of social responsibility with financial performance. These speaking engagements provided opportunities to influence emerging restaurant leaders and business students, encouraging approaches that valued community engagement and employee welfare alongside traditional success metrics. The invitations also created unexpected connections with other industry leaders who were addressing similar challenges about scaling authentic business practices without losing the personal elements that made their operations distinctive. These relationships led to collaborative projects, knowledge-sharing initiatives, and informal networks that strengthened our collective ability to demonstrate that responsible business practices could be financially sustainable at significant scale. One particularly meaningful speaking engagement brought me back to Ohio State University, where I addressed business students about entrepreneurship and strategic decision-making in family enterprises. Standing in the same lecture halls where I'd first learned analytical frameworks that would later inform my restaurant management approach, I was struck by how completely my relationship to academic business education had evolved. The theories and models that had once seemed abstract now represented practical tools that had created tangible value for employees, customers, investors, and communities. The analytical thinking that my family had viewed as disconnected from operational reality had proved essential for navigating complex challenges that traditional approaches couldn't address effectively. But I also emphasized to the students that business education provided frameworks rather than formulas, analytical capabilities rather than predetermined solutions. The success of our restaurant group had emerged from applying academic concepts within specific industry contexts, guided by values that prioritized authentic relationships and sustainable practices alongside financial performance. During the Howdy question and answer session, a student asked about managing conflicts between family expectations and personal ambitions, clearly struggling with pressures similar to those I'd experienced before leaving Thompson's. My response focused on the importance of understanding that love and respect don't require conformity, that families can support individual success even when it diverges from traditional expectations. The conversation reminded me of how much my relationship with my own family had evolved since those painful conflicts over Thompson's future direction. David and I now collaborated regularly on consulting projects that benefited from both his operational expertise and my strategic analysis, while maintaining separate businesses that allowed us to apply our respective strengths without compromising either approach. Our parents had initially struggled to understand why the sale of Thompson's represented success rather than failure, but they'd gradually recognized that preserving family harmony and enabling individual achievement were more important than maintaining traditional structures that no longer served everyone's needs effectively. The transformation of our family dynamics had required years of careful relationship building, honest communication about different priorities, and mutual recognition that professional disagreements didn't require personal animosity. We'd learned to appreciate each other's accomplishments without feeling threatened by different approaches to common objectives. Last month, David and I collaborated on a consulting project for a family restaurant group in Kentucky, whose succession challenges reminded us both of our own experience with Thompson's. The multi-generational conflict involved similar tensions between preservation and adaptation, traditional methods and innovative strategies, family loyalty and individual ambitions. Working together to develop solutions that honored both perspectives, we applied lessons learned through our own difficult journey toward mutual respect and separate success. The analytical frameworks I'd developed for strategic planning complemented David's insights about operational implementation, creating recommendations that addressed both immediate challenges and long-term sustainability requirements. The client. Family's response to our collaborative approach validated everything we'd learned about the value of different perspectives when they're properly integrated rather than forced into competition. Our combined expertise provided solutions that neither of us could have developed independently, demonstrating that our philosophical differences were actually complementary strengths when applied within appropriate contexts. The experience also reminded me of how much personal growth had emerged from the adversity of leaving Thompson's and building something entirely new. The confidence required to pursue national recognition, the analytical skills needed to develop scalable business models, and the leadership capabilities necessary to manage complex organizational growth had all been strengthened through the challenge of creating success without family support or predetermined structures. Today, Hoffman Thompson Hospitality Group operates 12 locations across 5 states, employs over 200 people, and generates annual revenues that support continued expansion while maintaining the community focus and authentic character that have always defined our brand identity. The partnership model we developed has attracted investors who share our values about sustainable business practices, creating expansion opportunities that strengthen rather than compromise our founding principles. But the most meaningful measure of success isn't financial performance or industry recognition. It's the knowledge that our restaurants serve as gathering places where people create memories, build relationships, and experience the kind of authentic hospitality that corporate standardization often eliminates in pursuit of operational efficiency. Every location we open creates jobs that provide living wages and advancement opportunities, supports local suppliers and community organizations, and demonstrates that business success can be achieved through practices that prioritize stakeholder welfare alongside shareholder returns. The journey from that painful family meeting to this moment of sustained success required courage to leave familiar structures, persistence through uncertainty, and wisdom to recognize that authentic achievement means creating value for others rather than simply proving personal worth through competitive advantage. Most importantly, it taught me that vindication doesn't come from forcing others to acknowledge their mistakes. It comes from building something so meaningful that it speaks for itself, creates opportunities for others, and demonstrates through sustained results that following authentic values can lead to outcomes that exceed anything possible through compromise or conformity. The analytical skills that were once dismissed have created opportunities that benefit hundreds of employees, thousands of customers, and dozens of communities, while the family relationships that were temporarily damaged have been rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect and appreciation for different forms of contribution. The letter that started this reflection sits framed on my office wall, not as a symbol of personal triumph, but as a reminder that meaningful success emerges from aligning individual capabilities with opportunities to serve others, and that the greatest achievements often begin with the courage to leave behind what's comfortable in pursuit of what's authentic. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.